Today on most domestic flights, you're lucky to get a bag of pretzels and a ginger ale. But back in the golden age of air travel, the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, pretty much every ticket came with a luxurious meal. Meals like this one from United Airlines in 1954, which includes pot roast, Delmonico potatoes, and a heavenly delight salad. So thank you to Trade Coffee for sponsoring this video as we fly the friendly skies. This time on Tasting History. So based on the age of most of my audience, I'm going to guess that you didn't get to fly during the golden age of air travel. Neither did I. I'm not quite that old, but I did get to be around for some of the vestiges of the golden age, like getting to go into the cockpit as a kid and have the wings put on me by the pilot himself. But when it came to food, I wasn't around for any of the good stuff. It was always just peanuts and Coke. And frankly, it's probably a good thing because the quality of airline food when I was a kid was not great. But that was not always the case, because like in the 1950s and 60s, airlines prided themselves on the quality of food that they were serving. That's because during the time, prices of tickets were regulated, so they couldn't compete on price, so they had to compete in other ways. Basically, how to make the flight actually more pleasant for the passengers, and one big thing was food. And today I can actually travel back in time and try some of that luxurious food with this. This is a cookbook that was put out in 1954 by United Airlines. It's called Favorite Recipes of Mainliner Chefs. And today I've chosen 3 dishes from this book so I can create an entire meal that would have been served on an airplane in 1954. First is a beef pot roast by Chef Emile Saltzman from the New York Flight Kitchen, then the Delmonico potatoes by Chef Marc Grugier of the Honolulu Kitchen, and finally the Heavenly Delight salad by Chef Edward Gerber of the Washington, D.C. Flight Kitchen. And the Flight Kitchen is where they would actually prepare the food before they would put it on the plane just before takeoff. Now, the second 2 recipes are pretty simple, but the first recipe has a lot of ingredients. So for the pot roast, what you're going to need is 2.5 pounds of beef chuck or round, 1 pound of veal bones. Finding veal bones is quite the struggle, so just use beef bones. 2 cups of beef stock, 2 medium onions quartered, 6 ounces of tomato paste, 2 bay leaves, 1 sprig of parsley, 1 cup of diced carrots, a half cup diced celery, 6 whole cloves, 10 whole peppercorns, 2 teaspoons of minced garlic, 2 tablespoons of butter or other fat, 1 cup of dry red wine, and then some flour and salt and pepper to taste. And as always, I'm going to have these recipes all up on the Tasting History website with metrics so you can follow along at home. So first, Chef Emile has you season the meat with plenty of salt and pepper and then dredge it in flour. Then melt the butter in a large pot and then add the meat and the marrow bones and let the meat sear for several minutes on one side and then flip it over and let it get some color on the other. Once it's lightly browned all over, add in the onions, celery, carrots, parsley, whole cloves, bay leaves, and peppercorns and let it cook for about 15 minutes. Then add the garlic, stock, tomato paste, and the wine, and then stir everything together and let it come to a simmer. Then put the lid on and let it cook at a simmer for about 2 hours or until the meat is just falling apart. And you can use your Trade Coffee to make Irish coffee, which was actually invented for the airlines, or by someone working for the airlines. It was invented in 1943 for passengers of a flying boat at Foynes Air Base in Ireland. Supposedly, a bunch of disgruntled passengers got off a plane, so the chef there just took some coffee and put some whiskey in it to calm everybody down, and there we have the Irish coffee. And you can drink some coffee, Irish or otherwise, while you make your Delmonico potatoes. For that, you'll need 8 medium potatoes, peeled and chopped, a half cup chopped pimentos, 2 cups half and half, and then some salt and pepper and plenty of Parmesan cheese to cover the top. So first, mix the potatoes with the pimentos, and then add a teaspoon and a half of salt and a teaspoon of pepper to the half and half, and set it on the stove to heat up just until it simmers. Then pour all of that over the potatoes, making sure the potatoes are covered, and then set the dish in the oven at 375 degrees Fahrenheit, 190 Celsius for about an hour and a half, or until the potatoes are totally cooked through. Then take it out of the oven, up the oven to 400 degrees, sprinkle a bunch of Parmesan cheese to cover the top, and return it to the oven for 5 more minutes or until the top is melted and lightly browned. Now before we make our Heavenly Delight salad, which really stretches the definition of a salad, make sure you subscribe to Tasting History, hit that like button, it really helps the channel, and let's talk about the history of airline food. So before we get into the history, I want to mention this wonderful resource that I used called Food in the Air and Space by Richard Foss. It's a wonderful deep dive into the history of food in the air, not just airlines, but in space, and even he goes all the way back to the 18th century with hot air balloons. It's fantastic. You should check it out if you are interested in this topic. I am not going all the way back to the 18th century. I am starting just after World War I in 1919, where on October 11th, the first meal on a commercial airline was served during a Handley Page flight from Paris to London. This was a prepackaged lunchbox with a sandwich and a piece of fruit, and just like Spirit Airlines today, food was not included in the price of the ticket, so you had to shell out 3 shillings for this cold lunch. And pretty much for the next decade, all meals on planes were cold. Like the Western Air Express meals on flights between Los Angeles and San Francisco, where cold fried chicken, potato salad, and sandwiches were catered by the Los Angeles-based Pig and Whistle, which sadly only closed a couple years ago. The same year that they were serving cold fried chicken, 1928, Lufthansa upped the ante with the first hot in-flight meal on flights from Berlin to Paris, where the food was made on the ground and then kept warm in insulated containers. This began airlines' increasing desire to provide passengers with the best and most cutting-edge cuisine available. The issue was keeping it warm because, especially on a longer flight, those insulated containers just didn't really cut it. And so if you wanted to heat the food up on the plane, you had to have an oven built on the plane, and most planes just weren't that big. But the flying boats of the 1930s were. And Pan American Airlines, Pan Am, installed galleys on many of their clippers so they could not only reheat the food, but actually cook it. They even had a dedicated dining room aboard with tables and white tablecloths, so it was more like eating in an actual restaurant. United Airlines soon followed suit and began installing kitchens on their planes where they would serve not cold but hot fried chicken as well as freshly scrambled eggs. This is also around the time when United Airlines really began priding themselves on the quality of their food. By the way, this is not sponsored by United Airlines, just talk about history. Maybe it would have been nice if they had sponsored it, though once I get to the part about flight attendants, stewardesses, and how they train them, they'd probably revoke that sponsorship. We'll get to that. Anyway, United made a huge leap forward in the quality of airline food in 1936 when in Oakland, California, they opened up their first flight kitchen. They hired top chefs to design a menu worthy of a wonderful luxury restaurant on the ground, but with the idea that these dishes could be served in the air. Far more elaborate dishes could be made this way by preparing them on the ground rather than in the air, and that is what they called their mainliner cuisine, and that is actually what we're cooking from today. It's those dishes that they created. Other airlines quickly followed suit, and menus from this time period really show how fancy airline food could get. Mignon of veal with Russian sauce, Boston cream pie, or an entire Irish-themed meal on St. Patrick's Day 1940 with a Dublin-style leg o' lamb stew. European airlines were going extra fine dining by serving everything from lobster to foie gras to peach melba. Now the next big technological leap came, as many technological leaps do, from a military contract. During World War II, William Maxson, or rather his company, developed several inventions for the US military. In addition to the Maxson multiple gun mount, which airlines never seem to have adopted, his company developed the Maxson whirlwind oven, which by circulating the air in the oven would heat things more evenly and much quicker. This was essentially the first convection oven, and it was designed to fit these meals called Maxson sky plates, which were served on airplanes for the Navy and the Army during the war and afterward. Then after the war, Pan American Airlines took these ovens and installed them on many of their commercial planes so that they could get rid of the full kitchen or have the food that was being brought on heated at a much quicker pace. It was also during the war that several airlines hired their first all-female flight attendant crews. Now, there had been female flight attendants, or stewardesses as they were called, since 1930. But during the war, the lack of men saw the female stewardess become the standard for quite some time. In fact, in subsequent decades, many airlines refused to hire men for the job at all. And they started using the female stewardesses as a selling point to their clientele, who were mostly men, basically saying, hey, you want your food and drink served by a pretty lady. Now this meant that stewardesses really had to become the ultimate service provider. Back in the 30s and even the early 40s, you actually had to be a registered nurse to become a flight attendant, but by the 50s, the airlines were doing all of that training themselves. As can be seen in this one ad from United Airlines, told you we'd get back to this, where they boast. 2 months ago, Sherry Woodruff couldn't even balance a cup of coffee. She was friendly, intelligent, and attractive, and wanted more than anything else to be a great stewardess. But then she had 5.5 weeks at United's Stewardesses School. We taught Sherry how to serve a gourmet dinner, how to soothe a first flyer, how to apply everything from makeup to first aid. Today she can warm a baby's formula with one hand and pour 4 cups of coffee with the other. They actually use these ads to entice young women to apply to learn the skills not of a great stewardess, but of a great housewife. They even went so far as to imply that on one of the flights is the best place for you to secure a husband, as can be seen in this 1967 ad. Old maid, that's what the other United Airlines stewardesses call her, because she's been flying for almost 3 years now. The average tenure of a United stewardess is only 21 months before she gets married. Maybe that's why more people fly United than any other airline. Everyone gets warmth, friendliness, and extra care, and someone may get a wife. Of course, as soon as they did get married, United would fire them, and that wasn't deemed illegal until 1971. They also had a mandatory retirement age of 30. Now, during the 50s and 60s, the airlines would actually use the stewardesses and the cuisine in tandem to sell passengers on their flights, especially with something they called themed flights. Like TWA had foreign accent flights. These were themed Italian, French, Old English, and Manhattan Penthouse. The flight attendants wore costumes. Like the English flight, they would wear like a wench costume, and then they would also play music from whatever country it was, and of course, the cuisine was from the country as well. Northwest Airlines really doubled down on these theme flights with something called the Fujiyama Room. On October 30th, 1955, they debuted these rooms featuring kitschy Asian decor on a number of planes, and they would serve food like shrimp, cheese, and fruit out of a pineapple with little umbrellas sticking out of it. It was sort of like Japan and tiki culture mashed up, thereby ruining both. Then there was Western Airlines' Hunt Breakfast flights from 1957. This was styled in the tradition of an Old English hunt breakfast, basically having breakfast out while you're hunting. And so all the food was themed that way too, but when it came to the sounds, it would be barking dogs and bugles. Now perhaps no flight married the idea of the pretty stewardess and the quality cuisine better than United Airlines' executive flight, something I'm sure the company would like to forget. These flew from 1953 to 1970 and were men only. Women were not allowed to purchase a ticket on these flights. Aimed at the executive businessmen of New York and Chicago, these flights would take off every day at 5 p.m., flying between the two cities. And there's an ad from the time that lets you know exactly what you can expect. United Airlines invites you to fly the Chicago Executive, a club in the sky for men only. You'll enjoy the informal club-like atmosphere, smoke your pipe or cigar if you wish, and make yourself more comfortable by using the pair of slippers provided. Enjoy congenial company in the lounge. A full-course steak dinner is table served by the 2 stewardesses aboard. It's a delicious meal prepared by the experienced continental chefs. Now, it wasn't just these themed flights, but really all flights of the 1950s and 60s that tried to up their game when it came not just to food, but just luxury in general. The seats became cushier than ever, often fully reclining, or on some longer flights, there would be an entire berth with a lay-down bed like you'd expect on a train or on one of the really top luxury airlines of today. And this is when the food really became a spectacle. There was a TWA flight where they would roll a trolley down the aisle with a whole piece of roast beef where they would slice it off and you'd be served roast beef au jus right there from the aisle. Other trolleys would include chilled seafood like lobster and crab legs. There were fresh fruit trays, salads and charcuterie, and even a dessert cart where they would make a sundae right in front of you. Bring that back. I'm starting a petition. Now, one of the most splendid setups for food actually came from Scandinavian Airlines, where they offered the Scandinavian country-style buffet during the late 60s, where they would carve a ham right there in the aisle. Now, while the food was getting more splendid, that doesn't actually mean it was getting better, because the flavor of the food wasn't exactly what it was on the ground. First of all, if it was made on the ground and then kept on the plane and then having to be reheated, you're essentially eating really fancy leftovers. But another big thing was that we don't taste the same when we're up in an airplane. Partly it's because the real lack of humidity messes with our sense of smell and hence our sense of taste. So you're not tasting the food as much as you would on the ground. So they started adding a lot more salt and sugar to their recipes to compensate. But while that may have helped with the flavor of the food, there was something else coming along in airline travel that would really screw up the service, and that was the adoption of jets. Airlines began switching over to jets, which went much faster than the earlier airplanes. And this meant that the 7-course meal, often served even on domestic flights, was becoming a thing of the past, at least in economy. Sometimes in first class now, I guess you get it, but even so, everything had to be sped up. The shorter service time also led to most airplanes swapping out glassware in China for plastic trays and plastic forks, because unlike the China, you didn't have to clean it right then and kind of stack it nicely, which took a lot of time, but rather you could just toss it in a bin and deal with it when you landed. Though this was published in 1954, and they're already eating off of plastic, so, you know, it was a gradual change. And all of these changes going on gave airline food a new reputation of being rubbery and bland. There's actually a wonderful musical from 1965 called Do I Hear a Waltz? And there's a whole song about the travails of airline travel at the time, and there's part that is all about the food. The shiny stuff is tomatoes, the salad lies in a group. The curly stuff is potatoes, the stuff that moves is soup. Anything that is white is sweet, anything that is brown is meat, anything that is gray, don't eat. And, you know, that was kind of the reputation for the next few decades. Of course, this change in the quality of the cuisine really only affected the economy class or coach class. And nothing exemplifies this kind of divide between coach and first class at the time better than the Great Sandwich War. See, it was 1958, and the International Air Transport Association, who made sure that all planes around the world were following the same rules, decided to allow for the first economy tickets to be purchased in transatlantic flights. But because they were going to be less expensive than the average ticket, they had to take stuff away, and this meant that nobody got any food any hot food who purchased this. All they could get was a sandwich. But there was Pan Am, an American airline, who said that a sandwich was some meat with bread, and then there were the European sandwiches, and they went all out. You'd get 5 slices of ox tongue, a lettuce heart, asparagus, and sliced carrots on a slice of bread. Or 5 slices of liver pate, fried crisp bacon, mushrooms, and sliced tomato on a slice of bread. Basically, it was a whole meal on a slice of bread, so it was a sandwich. And Pan Am was like, well, they're using that to their advantage. We're supposed to be on an even playing field, so the association had to come up with a definition of a sandwich. A sandwich must be cold, largely of bread or something similar, unadorned, self-contained, and must not include such fillings as caviar, oysters, or lobster. Basically, give the economy class passengers the meagerest food that you can possibly find, a theme which is still with us today. But should you have been able to afford a first-class fare, then the great meals would have continued. And should you have gobs of money available to you, then starting in 1969, you could book passage on the Concorde. The Concorde flew between cities in Western Europe and the east coast of the US and did so at twice the speed of sound, which would get you to your destination in just 3.5 hours. Now, these were flown mostly by British Airways and Air France, and the cost of a ticket, depending on the time, could cost as much as 30 times the average price of an economy ticket. But for that, you got there a lot faster, and you got quite the meal. What followed the coffee was a breakfast of fresh papaya, guava, pineapple, strawberries, and mangoes, croissants and brioche that might have come from a Paris bakery, a pretty good approximation of eggs Benedict, and a soufflé Gruyère, all washed down with Piper Heidsieck Cuvée Diplomatique. The china, of course, was Limoges. What really ended the splendid food of airlines, as well as the golden age of air travel itself, was the age of deregulation, which started in 1978. Airfare had been regulated for decades, making it so that the only way the airlines had to compete was through perks like wonderful food and their flight attendants or stewardesses, leg room, the comfort, entertainment, or those flights where they had dogs and bugles playing throughout the cabin, that hunt breakfast. I wouldn't like that. But with the deregulation, they could start to do price wars, and this was good and bad. The good part was that it dramatically lowered the price of airfare. For instance, this TWA list of flights from 1955 shows that a flight from Boston to Los Angeles cost $106. That's about $1,200 in today's money. Also, since planes were a lot slower at the time and had to make multiple stops, that flight took 12 hours. No thanks. But these price drops made it so a lot more people had flying available to them. But that also meant that the quality of the flight would, of course, go down. More seats in planes were required to make up for lower fares, which meant a far less comfortable flight, and there were also fewer options for food, and on many flights, no food at all. This is when Southwest distinguished themselves as the peanut airline, and for most of my childhood, I recall fondly my dad coming back from business trips, always on Southwest Airlines it feels like, and he'd have his pockets just filled with these little bags of peanuts, or if I was lucky, the honey roasted peanuts, and that was wonderful. Now, the early 80s saw the golden age of air travel, especially in economy class, come to an end. Many business and first-class flights still go to great lengths to offer quality food, often getting top chefs to prepare menus for the airline. But for me, I don't really mind. I'd rather pay less and get, a stupidly expensive sandwich at the airport and just bring it on with me. The one food you should never bring on an airplane is French fries. I never do that. It just smells up the whole cabin. Don't do that. Though, you could bring on this pot roast because it is also smelling up the cabin, my house, but it smells really, really good. So as soon as the pot roast is cooked through, take it out and simmer down the liquid to about half and then strain it out and save the onions and other vegetables back to serve with the roast itself. And now to prepare a very quick dessert or salad, because even though this is absolutely a dessert, it's actually in the salad section of the book. You'll need 4 tart apples cut into small pieces, then add 32 mini marshmallows and cut 8 maraschino cherries in quarters and mix those all together with the marshmallows and the apples. I'm also making a half portion because this is still going to make a lot of Heavenly Delight salad. In a separate bowl, whip a cup of heavy cream into whipped cream and then add a teaspoon of lemon juice, a teaspoon and a half of mayonnaise, and a teaspoon and a half of honey. Mix it all together, then mix it with the apples, and it's ready to go. And here we are, a full meal worthy of a United Airlines flight from the golden age of air travel. I just have to show you this tray. I put the cups over there, but how cool is this? It's actually not from the 50s, it's from the, I believe the early 60s. I think they said it was about 1963 or 4. But I just thought it was so cool. It's an actual tray from the time. It even has like little salt and peppers. And of course, plasticware. So I'm gonna try to eat a pot roast with this. Let's give it a try. All right, even after like 60 years, the knife is pretty good. Let's go. I knew it would be amazing because it smelled so good. It is so tender, it just falls apart. I really, really like the addition of kind of adding in the onions and the other things that we're cooking on top of it. Unless you get like a bay leaf, don't eat a whole bay leaf, but it's so flavorful, and I'll be eating the whole thing over the next couple days. Now let's try the potatoes. So I think that I made a mistake and maybe didn't chop them as fine as I should have. I mean, the flavor's great. It's cream and potatoes and Parmesan cheese. What's not to like? I just think that if I had diced them a little finer, the texture would be a little bit better, or at least they'd be a bit better coated with the cream mixture. Honestly, even doing these as mashed potatoes, I think that's how I'd prefer them. And finally, on to our salad dessert. And get a little bit of everything, a little apple, little cherry. it's not as sweet as I expected. Now, the original recipe says you could actually add sugar. I wouldn't. These are tart apples, but they're not, it's not tart. It has a little zing from the apples and from the lemon juice, but it's plenty sweet. It doesn't need to be any sweeter because, I mean, there's plenty of sweet stuff in there. But it reminds me of ambrosia, kind of. If you've ever had ambrosia, my Nana would once in a while make that for Easter. It's fun. It's delicious. I wouldn't call it a salad. It is definitely a dessert, but, you know. So I gotta say, all three dishes, really good. I would make all three again. I'd probably mash the potatoes, but that's the only change I would make. That pot roast is definitely going on in my repertoire of weekly or probably monthly dishes to make. And I will see you next time on Tasting History. For decades, the epitome of luxury travel in Europe was the Orient Express, and that is in no small part due to the exquisite cuisine served aboard the train, like these lamb cutlets fried in butter with creamy Duchess potatoes. So thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video as we ride the Orient Express, this time on Tasting History. The Orient Express is probably the most famous train in history, though it wasn't actually just one train, but a long-distance railway service that operated numerous trains, all part of the Compagnie Internationale des Wagons-Lits, or International Sleeping Car Company. Running from Paris to Constantinople, later Istanbul, it enjoyed two golden ages. One was from about 1890 until World War I, and the second was between the two world wars. And in both periods, one of the most enticing aspects of the journey was the food being served. Now, starting in the 1890s and going up really all the way till World War II, the menus on the Orient Express and the other trains operated by the company really heavily relied on the recipes of Auguste Escoffier, at least when they were operating the trains near Paris. They included some of his iconic dishes like lobster thermidor, peach melba, jambon agéli or ham aspic, and there were dozens of different potato and lamb cutlet recipes, which is what I'm going to be making today. A plate of his côtelette d'agneau à la minute, and one of his most famous recipes, pommes de terre duchesse, or Duchess potatoes. So, to make these Duchess potatoes, Escoffier says to start off with a croquette mixture, for which you will need 2.5 pounds, or a little more than 1 kilogram of russet potatoes, 7 tablespoons, or 100 grams of butter, 2 teaspoons of salt, plus more for the water that we're going to boil the potatoes in, 1 teaspoon of white pepper, a pinch of nutmeg, and 1 whole egg plus 4 egg yolks at room temperature. So first cut the potatoes into even-sized pieces, and then add them to a pot and cover with water, then add a good amount of salt, about a tablespoon, and bring the water to a boil and let them cook for about 10 minutes until you can pierce them with a knife, though Escoffier says that they should still be quite firm at this point. Today, usually you would just boil them all the way and you're done with the cooking. But Escoffier says to first boil and then dry them out in the oven. So that's what we're going to do. So drain the potatoes and then set them on a lined baking sheet and bake at 400 degrees Fahrenheit, 205 Celsius for another 25 to 30 minutes or until they're very soft. At this point, take them out and pass them through a strainer. Now this can take quite a while, and at certain points you'll be like, nothing is happening, but I promise you, they will go through if you press them through. You can also use just like a ricer. It's going to be a lot faster, but it won't be quite as creamy. So do it the Escoffier way and press them through a strainer. Then set the pot of potatoes over low heat and add in the butter and stir it in, and then add in the 2 teaspoons of salt, 1 teaspoon of white pepper, and that large pinch of nutmeg. Stir these all in and then take it off the heat. Now touch the potatoes, and if they're warm, that's fine, but if they're quite hot, then you need to let them cool down till they are just warm, a little above room temperature, because we're going to add the eggs, and if you add them when they're too hot, they'll scramble and you'll have to start all over. But once the potatoes are just warm, add the egg yolks and the whole egg and mix everything in until it's completely smooth. Now the exciting part of these potatoes is that you can shape them in different ways, and Escoffier gives us a few options in how to shape them. He says mold into the form of a small brioche à tête, bread rolls, or flat cakes, or pipe out with a piping bag and star tube onto a buttered tray. The brioche à tête sounds kind of interesting. It would basically be like a little ball of potato with another little ball on top, but the more traditional and frankly more impressive way to do it is to pipe them. So using a star tip, pipe large mounds of potato onto a parchment-lined baking sheet. This recipe should make between 6 and 10 depending on the size of mounds you want. Also, it does help to let the potatoes come to room temperature before piping because they'll be a little firmer and hold their shape better. Also, once you've piped them, you want them to be even firmer, so put them into the refrigerator for about an hour or so, uncovered, and this will let them be firm enough so that you can brush on some melted butter without ruining all of the wonderful piping that you just did. Once you've brushed on some melted butter, set the tray in the oven, again at 400 degrees Fahrenheit, for about 25 minutes or until they are nicely browned on top. Now these potatoes, while delicious and creamy, do have a reputation for being a little dry, and that's because there isn't as much cream and butter as like a mashed potato because they need to hold their shape. So they are usually served with some sort of rather fatty meat, and for that today I'm going to be making côtelettes d'agneau à la minute. Cut the cutlets very thin, season them and shallow fry in very hot clarified butter. Arrange them in a circle on a dish, sprinkle with a little lemon juice and the cooking butter after adding a pinch of chopped parsley. Serve immediately. Simple but delicious. So for this, all you'll need is some very small lamb cutlets, and you want to cut them as thin as possible, and you want to get the smallest that you can. You don't want big old lamb chops. As small as you can. Then some clarified butter for frying. You'll also need some juice from fresh lemon and minced parsley for garnish. So season the lamb with a bit of salt and pepper, and then heat the clarified butter in a wide pan, and once it hits about 350 degrees Fahrenheit, carefully set the lamb in about 3 or 4 pieces at a time. Fry them on one side for 2 or 3 minutes, and then flip them over and fry on the other side until the lamb is cooked through and reaches an internal temperature of 145 degrees. As soon as they're cooked, take them out of the butter and set them aside for 2 to 3 minutes just to rest while you transfer your Duchess potatoes onto a plate, and then plate the lamb, sprinkle with a bit of parsley, and drizzle with a bit of the lemon mixed with the butter that the lamb was fried in. That lemon butter is really the best part of this dish. Anyway, I love frying things in clarified butter, but I can't imagine doing it on a train, sloshing about as it's going down the rails. But that is exactly what the cooks on the Orient Express did. They were cooking while the train was in motion. But that's what you had to do if you wanted to provide your passengers with the freshest haute cuisine available on the rails. And that brings up the question, what exactly was it like to ride and dine on the Orient Express? The origin of the Orient Express actually begins in America, where in 1867 a Belgian civil engineer, Georges Nagelmakers, rode in one of the new Pullman train cars, which were the pinnacle of luxury, both in sleeping accommodations and in dining. He was so impressed with these Pullman train cars that he decided to go back to Europe and start a train company with cars that would rival the Pullmans. The issue was that in America, you could get on the train and ride for several days uninterrupted. But in Europe at the time, pretty much all of the train tracks and the trains were run by individual countries. So every time you crossed a border, you would have to get out of the train, go through customs, take all of your luggage off, and then usually get onto a completely different train before going another few hundred miles until you reach the next country. But Georges had a plan, and he had the contacts to make this plan happen, because he was family friends with King Leopold II of Belgium. Now, King Leopold II is in many ways one of the greatest monsters in history. He was responsible for millions, possibly like 10 million deaths in the Belgian Congo, but he was also a train enthusiast, and he was very powerful and well connected, and that is what Georges needed. So with King Leopold II's help, Georges was able to convince all of these different countries to work together to allow this one train to go freely between the countries, basically all the way across Europe. And after some false starts and a few test runs on a smaller scale, the Orient Express made its inaugural trip in October of 1883. Sort of. Because technically the Orient Express couldn't get from Paris to Constantinople at the time because there weren't train tracks for this last part. So you actually had to go from Paris to a town just south of Bucharest, and then you would take a ferry across the Danube to Bulgaria, where you would take an entirely different train to Varna on the Black Sea, and once you arrived at Varna, you had to take a steamship to Constantinople. It wasn't until August of 1888 that the train could go unimpeded all the way from Paris to the Ottoman capital. But even in those early years, The cuisine was supposedly top-notch and was definitely something to be talked about. In fact, one of the first people to ever ride on that inaugural train, who just happened to be a reporter, wrote, "In the front of the train, the dining car, with its curtains coquettishly raised, casts an extraordinary luster on the whole scene. Large gas lights illuminate a veritable banquet hall. The tables, side by side, those with 4 seats on the right, those with 2 seats on the left, in 7 rows, are set up in a most sumptuous manner. The bright white tablecloths and napkins are artistically folded by the restaurant sommelier. The crystal clear sparkle of the glassware, filled with rubies of red wine and topaz of white. The pure crystal water decanters and the silver caps of the champagne bottles dazzle the crowd both inside and outside, a contrast to the sorrow of parting seen on their faces." And the dining car wasn't just the restaurant, but it also had a drawing room for the ladies with wonderful plush velvet chairs, and then a library/smoking room for the men that had leather armchairs and bookcases filled with books, maps, and newspapers which were swapped in and out at each country they passed through. The dining room itself, lit by gaslight chandeliers, was furnished with wall tapestries, silk drapes, and leather and velvet chairs, and there were tables of 4 and of 2 and could seat 42 passengers in all. The tables were set with fresh flowers, polished silverware, porcelain china, and baccarat crystal glasses, just like you would find in any of the fine Parisian or London hotel restaurants of the day. And because of the international nature of the train, the staff in the early years were expected to speak multiple languages. Usually it was French, German, and English, or Italian, and sometimes other languages like Turkish. In fact, in 1894, it was said that collectively the entire staff on the train could speak 50 different languages and dialects. Now, the kitchen staff on the train usually were all French, and they worked in some of the best French hotel restaurants that Paris had to offer before getting courted and working on the train. And they all worked under the chef de cuisine. And in October of 1883, someone wrote of the genius of how this chef put together the menu. See, as you crossed from country to country, from France and Austria and Bulgaria and all these other countries, the menu would change to reflect the country that you were in. So yes, you would still have some French food, obviously, but you would also have some cuisine from the location that you're at. This genius of a man has prepared us dishes of exquisite flavor, with menus varied by the countries which we pass through. Danube sterlet, fresh Romanian caviar, and Turkish pilaf, while the sommelier follows suit, pouring us the most illustrious vintages of the Moselle, the Rhine, of Hungary and Romania. And not only was the food excellent, but according to one American traveler, it was well priced as well. Cy Warman said the food was equal to the best in any country, and the rates are reasonable. You have 3 good meals for $2.55, which in America, in the average dining car, would cost $3. Well, by golly, that is a deal. He was also really impressed with the sleeping arrangements on the train, because most trains in the US at that time were kind of done in a dormitory style, so you were sleeping right next to someone with just a little curtain between you, unless you were paying for like a suite on one of the Pullman trains. But on the Orient Express, a compartment holds 2 or 4 people, and often, with the judicious expenditure of a few francs, the voyager can secure a small compartment all to himself, and he is quite as secluded and comfortable as he would be in the stateroom of a Pullman or Wagner. Now, while we are making an Orient Express dinner, the day, of course, would have started out with an Orient Express breakfast, and this was usually different kinds of eggs and an assortment of meats and fruit and different pastries. But according to Joseph Riley, an Englishman who was traveling in 1889, he said most of the passengers just didn't really eat anything, but just drank a cup of tea or coffee or a glass of wine. And I guess they were on vacation, so why shouldn't they have wine for breakfast? And maybe they were just saving room for lunch, because lunch could be 7 to 10 courses, and it was supposedly so excellent that if you were royalty, you would get on to eat even if you didn't have anywhere to go. At Sofia, Prince Ferdinand of Bulgaria got into the train. It appeared that Prince Ferdinand's pastime was to join the train in this way, have his déjeuner on board, get out at the frontier, and return to his capital by the next train. It seems a curious mode of enjoyment, but probably Bulgaria was less lively than it has become since. Anyhow, we presently saw some apricot omelets walking about and asked for some, but were told that this was a déjeuner commandé, and we could not share it, to which deprivation we resigned ourselves. Dinner was similarly delicious, but far more fancy, because on the train, dinner was a black tie affair. Men would dress in their best, and women would put on their best gowns and jewels, and it was very, very formal. Though there was one time on the train that you should eat dinner before you actually get on the train, and that is when you are leaving Istanbul to head back to Paris, because there was no diner car when it left Istanbul. The diner car didn't actually meet up with it until it got to Bulgaria. So just in time for breakfast, so make sure to eat before you get on board. Now, the first golden age of the Orient Express came to a rather abrupt halt at the outbreak of World War I. Though one of the dining cars used by the Wagonlit company actually played a pivotal role when, on November 11, 1918, German officers signed their surrender in a dining car known as the Compiègne Wagon. Unfortunately, the Germans used that same dining car in a bit of spite in 1940 when they demanded the surrender of the French to the German army during World War II. And it was never used again because Hitler had it blown up when he realized he was going to lose the war, just so the Allies couldn't get their hands on it again. Now, between these two world wars, well, that is the second and most glorious golden age of the Orient Express. And in the 1920s, just a couple years after it came back into service, it was redesigned with steel carriages, which offered a more comfortable ride. And they'd also been designed with the modern Art Deco interiors that would come to be so iconic. And this was the train that featured in Agatha Christie's Murder on the Orient Express. Now, when she published that book, there had never been a Murder on the Orient Express. But I guess she jinxed it, because only about a year after she published it, in 1935, somebody was murdered. It was a wealthy Romanian fashion designer. She was robbed and pushed out the window and found on the side of the tracks a little while later. Now, 2 years after she published her novel, another novelist, Beverly Nichols, wrote of actual experience on the train. And while it didn't include any murder, it did include lunch. A bell tinkles in the corridor of the Orient Express. Lunch! We get up with hunger gnawing at our inside, filled with delight at the prospect of eating crisp rolls and potato mayonnaise, and veal and petit pois, and slabs of fromage de pays, washed down by white wine drunk from a tumbler, which is the only way to drink white wine. And not only does the prospect of the food allure us, but the fact that we shall be devouring it in a fantastic chariot of steel and glass, hurling through a foreign country. There must be something seriously wrong with the man who does not enjoy lunching in the train. Now, this second golden age of the train ended at the outbreak of World War II, and while it did return to service after the war, its golden age never really returned. Partly it was because of the Iron Curtain. Europe was now divided in two, and the train traveling through so many Soviet countries became a logistical nightmare when it came to travel visas. Also, there was the proliferation of air travel. So why take several days to go across Europe when you could take several hours instead? This is not to say that the luxury of the Orient Express ended. Quite the opposite. In fact, it just got more and more luxurious because the train itself ended up becoming the destination. You didn't take it from Paris to Istanbul because you needed to get from Paris to Istanbul. You took it because you wanted to ride on the Orient Express. It's kind of like the difference between taking an ocean liner to get from England to New York rather than taking a cruise where you're not really going anywhere, you just want to be on a cruise ship. But the train continued to be in service between Paris and Istanbul until 1977 and still ran other routes until 2009 when it ceased operation. Though in recent years, a completely restored version of the Orient Express, which is supposed to be really luxurious, has been out on the tracks again, and you can actually ride the Orient Express. And supposedly, they even try to recreate some of the earlier dishes from the golden age of the Orient Express. Though I don't know if they make these exact Auguste Escoffier recipes that I am about to eat right now. And here we are. Lamb cutlets fried in butter with creamy Duchess potatoes. So the potatoes, you can actually just pick them up, but that's not classy, so you should cut into them. They're really, they look firmer than like a mashed potato. Let's give it a try. It's very hot. I never test the temperature of my food before I eat it. It's a really bad habit, and it often burns my mouth. I have no patience, I guess. Quite warm. But once I got past the burning, the texture is actually really nice. They are drier than like a mashed potato, but they're also creamier at the same time. Like the texture is so soft and smooth because we pressed it through the sieve. When it comes to the flavor, they're really rich. Like you can really taste all of that butter in there. They're often made with cream today. It's like part cream, part butter. So that might change the texture. But these, with all the butter and the egg, they're just so rich. But it does need some of that fat from the lamb, which I'm going to try right now, especially when you drizzle on that lemon butter. Oh, so good. Here we go. That lemon butter is heavenly. They're perfectly cooked. Like I said, you want to get them nice and thin because if they're too thick, they'll start to burn on the outside before it's totally cooked all the way through. And you don't really want any char or anything like that. You want it tender all the way through. They're so flavorful. I could eat like a dozen of these because they're so small. But on the train, this would have been one of like 7 or 8 courses. So you would just want to take a couple bites and then move on to the next dish. I didn't make 7 or 8 courses, so I'll be eating all of these. They're absolutely wonderful if you like lamb, which I do. Fantastic. I've so often wondered what it was like to fly aboard Concorde, traveling through the stratosphere at twice the speed of sound, making the flight from New York to Europe in less than 3 hours. Unfortunately, as it is no longer in operation, I will not be able to do that. So I will have to content myself with dining like they did on board with this meal of lobster with shallot beurre blanc and Scottish smoked salmon with caviar. So thank you to Bombas for sponsoring this video as we dine aboard Concorde, this time on Tasting History. I was inspired to make this video after getting the Lego Concorde that you see behind me, fantastic build, and as soon as I decided to do the video, I went onto eBay to see if I could find any plates or silverware from the 70s that were on the airplane. And not only did I find a good number of them, but the man who sold them to me had actually been one of the cooks for the Concorde in 1977 when it started flying from JFK to Heathrow. How freaking cool is that? His name is John Ninivaggi, and at 22 years old, while working under Henri Prieto, they cooked 208 meals every day to be served on the 2 flights leaving JFK. So I was able to ask him about his experiences and, most importantly, if he remembered any of the actual recipes that they used. Unfortunately, it turns out they didn't use recipes at all. The chef came up with the dishes and then everything was kind of done orally, and so nothing got written down. And since I work from recipes here on the show, I am actually looking at the recipes of Paul Bocuse, the great French chef who designed the menu for the very first flights for Concorde. Now, as I look through different menus to decide on exactly what to make, certain dishes seem to appear more often than others. Things like steak, duck, venison, and of course, lobster. And many of the very early flights seem to serve lobster as well as Scottish smoked salmon with creme fraiche and caviar. Very expensive, but what do you expect when you're paying $9,000 for a one-way ticket, at least in today's dollars? So using the recipes of Paul Bocuse as a guide, I will endeavor to recreate one of the first meals on one of those early flights. And we're going to start with the easier dish, which is the Scottish smoked salmon and caviar. And sometimes these things were served separately, sometimes together, all different ways. But they weren't served, it seems, as a very tall hors d'oeuvre or canapé stacked on top of each other, and the reason was made evident in one of the very first flights. They tried these new canapés that had a lot of stuff on each individual dish, and on takeoff, it all tipped over and we couldn't use them. caviar all over the floor. So instead of stacking them high, I'm going to try to recreate an image that I actually saw of these being served, and that is kind of as a rose. So start by taking 4 or 5 slices of the smoked salmon and lay them in a line and have each piece slightly overlap the one beneath. Then we are going to roll them up, not too tight, but tight enough that they will keep their shape. Then once rolled, if it is more than about an inch wide, you can slice it in the middle so it'll make 2 even spirals. Then splay the ends a little bit so they kind of look like a rose. I'm sure this takes a lot of practice to really get right. Place that on the plate and then pipe just a little bit of creme fraiche in the center of each rose, and if you like, you can do an extra dollop on a little piece of salmon to the side. Then we need some caviar. Now on Concord, they used beluga caviar, and I looked around, I couldn't find any, and frankly, at $300 an ounce, I didn't look that hard. But I did find some white sturgeon caviar, which is still a hefty $80 an ounce, so that's what I'm using. Luckily, an ounce actually goes a long way, just a little dabble do ya. Now caviar is a particularly appropriate food for eating in an airplane, not because it's expensive, but because it is salty. Because when you are 60,000 feet in the air, which is how high Concorde flew, and in a very low humidity environment, which is how all planes are, your taste buds just don't work as well, especially when it comes to tasting sweet and tasting salty. So caviar kind of fixes that. And now we move on to the lobster with beurre blanc sauce. Let's start with the sauce. You'll need 1 3/4 sticks or 200 grams of softened butter, 2 shallots, 2 tablespoons of red wine vinegar, and a pinch of salt and pepper very finely ground. So start by peeling the shallots and chopping them up, and you want to make the smallest pieces that you possibly can. Then put those in a heavy saucepan, the heavier the better because it will retain the heat so you can melt the butter, and then add in the red wine vinegar and then set that on the stove over medium heat. Start to give it a stir as the liquid evaporates, and you want to leave it simmering until all of the liquid is gone and only the shallots remain. Then turn off the heat and add in the butter just a couple tablespoons at a time, stirring quickly as the butter melts. Once melted, you can add the next couple tablespoons and continue until all of the butter is melted, and if it cools off too much and it stops melting, you can set it over a double boiler or over a very, very low heat. You don't want anything to burn or scorch, just warm enough that that butter melts. But as the butter melts, it doesn't look like melted butter, but rather more like a cream sauce. Then add the salt and the pepper and keep that sauce warm while you cook your lobster tails, for which you will need some lobster tails quite obviously, but then you'll also need some sweet paprika and a little melted butter. Start by using kitchen shears to cut the top of the lobster shell all the way down to the tail, but leave the tail uncut. Then flip it over and break the bottom of the tail to help loosen the meat, and then you need to loosen the meat on top as well. For this you can use a knife or you can use your fingers. Then you want to remove the dark vein, which is actually the digestive tract, running down the center of the meat, and then pull the meat out, leaving it attached at the base. Then close the shell back up and lay the meat on top. Now you can actually remove the meat completely from the shell if you want to. This is really just for presentation. Also for presentation is to sprinkle a little paprika on top. It really doesn't add much flavor, but it makes it look nice. Then set the lobster tails on a baking sheet and bake in the oven at 375 degrees Fahrenheit, 190 Celsius for about 10 minutes if you have 2 lobster tails. It's really kind of dependent on the size of them. What you're looking for is an opaque meat, and the temperature should be about 135 degrees Fahrenheit. Then brush a little of the melted butter on them and set them back in the oven, this time with the broiler on, for just a couple of minutes. And while they finish cooking, I wanted to let you know that I am going to be leading 3 more cruises. I've already done a couple down the Nile and down the Danube, and I'm doing 3 more. I have one this November, starting in Paris, going down the Seine, and then we have Colombia and Vietnam and Cambodia next year. So if you want to sign up for those, I will put a link in the description. Unfortunately, while I wish you could take Concorde to get to Paris, you can't because it hasn't run in well over 20 years. So the next best thing I can offer is that you imagine yourself on board Concorde, which you can do once I tell you a little bit more about what that experience would be like. Concorde is the most famous and definitely most successful of the SSTs, or supersonic transports. It was developed as a partnership between the French and the British governments, who shared the expense 50-50. Though there seems to have been constant bickering between the two governments about pretty much everything, including the name. See, the word Concorde means harmony in French, and it also means harmony in English, but in English there is no E at the end. In French, there is an E at the end. So ironically, there was a lot of bickering over which form of the word harmony, Concorde, should be used. And in the end, obviously, the French won because there is an E there, but it is said that the British only allowed this if they could say that the E stood for excellence. Good job, British government. Now, after years of development, Concorde made its first flight in 1969, but it was not a passenger flight, but they still had a full menu developed. This was the menu created mostly by the French chef Paul Bocuse, though it seems the dessert was left up to Gaston Lenôtre. He was a famous pastry chef at the time, and he created the Gâteau Concorde, or Concorde cake, and this was a chocolate cake with different layers of chocolate mousse and chocolate meringue, and then covered in kind of a shell of chocolate shavings. And it is said to have been made for the Concorde, but I couldn't find it on any of the menus, so maybe it was just kind of a one-time thing. Maybe it's on some of the French menus. They're harder to find, at least for me, than the British Airways, but I never saw it, but I'd still like to make it one day. But if passengers weren't getting this Concorde cake on the Concorde, then what were passengers eating? Well, your culinary journey actually began before boarding the plane. See, when Concorde began commercial flights on January 21st, 1976, every seat was essentially first class. The planes only had about 100 seats, and every one of them was sold at a premium, about $9,000 one way in today's money. So at those kind of prices, one would expect a bit of a lounge experience when at the airport, and dedicated Concorde lounges were created at all of the major airports that it went in and out of. When the lounge at JFK opened, the enormous room spanned 2 stories and thousands of square feet, an oasis of tranquility reserved exclusively for Concorde's 100 passengers. Daylight streamed through huge floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a golden glow across the inviting modern interior. The decor exuded an understated elegance, with smart leather couches, club chairs, and polished tables arranged for effortless comfort. While you waited, champagne and other beverages were served as you walked up to the buffet, and there was pastry, fresh pastry and fruit and all sorts of other breakfast items, and they even had a chef who was making omelets to order. Then it is time for you to actually board the plane. Due to the size of the cabin, space was rather limited. The seats were small, there wasn't much overhead room, and there were restrictions on how much luggage you could bring. Add to that the fact that it got quite warm inside as you traveled at 1,300 miles an hour, and it paled in comparison with the usual first-class experience of the day. The plane actually got so hot at those supersonic speeds that the metal frame would actually expand during flight, so the plane was 2 inches longer up in the air than it was down on the ground. But it is not the heat or lack thereof or the size that made it a luxury experience. What did make flying on Concorde a luxury experience was the fact that you were going 1,300 miles an hour. You were less concerned with comfort when your flight time was less than half of what everyone else's was. Because at that time, and still today really, a flight from JFK to Heathrow could be about 7 to 7.5 hours. On Concorde, it was about 3 hours. Speed was the selling point for Concorde. It actually wasn't sold as a luxury experience, but rather as a tool for diplomats and businessmen. You could leave London in the morning and arrive at JFK before you actually left London. You were going so fast. It was time travel. Then you could have a business meeting in Manhattan at lunch, head back to the Concorde, and be back in London before dinner. It was absolutely incredible, especially when you think in the late 70s and early 80s, there would have still been people around who could remember the time that that same journey took 5 days on a transatlantic ocean liner. 5 days, 3 hours. Insane. Now, perhaps nothing illustrates the speed with which Concorde flew better than when on July 13, 1985, Phil Collins opened the Live Aid concert at Wembley Stadium, then boarded Concorde, flew to New York, took a helicopter from New York to JFK Stadium in Philadelphia, and closed the concert there. He opened it and he closed it on different continents. But even though speed was the main reason for flying on Concorde, at the prices that they were charging, people still expected some degree of luxury. One degree of luxury was the fact that most of the flight there was absolutely no turbulence. Now, takeoff and landing were known to be very turbulent because they had to take off and land at really steep angles. But once you got up to 60,000 feet, you're above all of the weather, so there ain't no turbulence. Also, at those heights, one could observe the curvature of the Earth. Truly a luxury experience. And then, as soon as you hit cruising altitude, the feast could begin. 6 flight attendants would begin serving cocktails, Dom Pérignon champagne, and canapés. Meals on the first flights included lobster with caviar canapés, filet mignon, a palm heart salad with Roquefort dressing, and then strawberries and cream with more champagne. Nearly every menu had options for fish or chicken or steak, along with the occasional duck, pheasant, venison, or on British Airways, game pie. Veal was a very popular dish, and even in 1977, it sold for $22.50 a pound. That's about $120 today. According to John Ninavaji, the cook who was there in those early flights, who sold me all of my plates, the veal was actually the only thing that they didn't butcher themselves, and that's kind of what made it such a luxury dining experience. Everything was from scratch. He says that basically everything except the caviar and the pate were the only things that came out of a can, and then sometimes pastries would be brought in from bakeries. Still fresh though, but everything else there was done from scratch. They made all of their sauces from scratch. They baked their bread. They used that bread to make breadcrumbs from scratch. So it was just a really luxury, top quality experience that you would get if you went to the finest New York restaurants. The only real difference was that they cooked everything slightly under. Everything was done undercooked because then the food would be transferred to the actual plane, where the flight attendants would continue to cook it in an oven to bring it up to temperature so that when it was served, it wasn't overdone, but it was still hot, and it was served exactly how the chef wanted. Then these meals were served on the finest china. For British Airways, it was all made by Royal Doulton. The cutlery on Air France was particularly iconic as it was designed by Raymond Loewy, famous for his locomotive and car designs. It's said that Andy Warhol loved his cutlery so much that he would regularly steal entire sets whenever he flew on Concorde. But you don't need to steal stuff from Concorde because pretty much on every flight, they would give you a gift. These were things like Wedgwood paperweights, silver photo frames, letter openers, or one of the more popular gifts, a silver hip flask. So some of these meals, especially the lunches, would be 6 courses, and then you would have cocktails and cigars afterward. So on a 3-hour flight, you actually spend almost the entire time just eating and being served. And that's a good thing because it doesn't seem there was a lot else to do, seeing as there were no in-flight movies, there was no music playing until the 80s, and there were no screens of any kind except for one screen at the front of the cabin that told you your altitude and your speed, usually around Mach 2. So other than eating, if you wanted to entertain yourself, you had to actually talk to your fellow passengers. Can you believe it? The plane was actually kind of set up, though, to make that an easy thing to do. People would be able to get up and walk around with their cocktails, kind of just having a cocktail hour. And it helped because a lot of them knew each other. The atmosphere in the cabin was one of an exclusive club, and it was because these were the people who controlled the world's finance, and the world's trade. They were all in the Concorde Club, a club that cost $9,000 for 3 hours. Not a club that most of us are in. And if you didn't want to talk to all the other rich people, then you could, back then, go up to the cockpit. They had an open door policy, and many pilots talk about how much of the flight was spent entertaining the passengers up in the cockpit. Now, this is something that I remember doing as a kid, not on Concorde obviously, but on the now defunct America West Airlines out of Phoenix. I remember getting those wings, and that That was the best. They were still made of metal back then too. A time gone by. Something else that has gone by, unfortunately, is the Concorde itself, because it was the last of the supersonic transports, the ones that actually held passengers. See, by the late 90s, Concorde had lost much of its appeal. Despite several refreshes to the interior, it just couldn't compare with the newer business and first class on airplanes, especially once they introduced the lie-flat seats. It was kind of done for the Concorde, because even though, yes, the flight would take 3 hours longer, or sometimes 4 hours longer, you're spending that time laying down, sometimes sleeping, so yeah, do you really want to pay $9,000 to just get there a few hours earlier? Seems not. This was paired with rising maintenance costs and lower passenger numbers following a crash in Paris in July of 2000, which killed all 109 people on board, plus 4 on the ground. Things got even worse after 9/11, and both Air France and British Airways decided to discontinue service. The last commercial Concorde flight was on October 24th, 2003, and on that flight from New York to London, they served quite the last breakfast. Alongside endless champagne was Scottish smoked salmon with caviar, pancetta-wrapped filet of beef and lamb cutlet with potatoes, lobster fish cakes with a Bloody Mary relish, a mushroom and truffle omelet with hash browns and grilled tomato, Greek yogurt with passion fruit and berries, then a dessert of buttermilk panna cotta and a cheese plate with Stilton cheddar and goat's cheese with fig essence. Quite the feast. I don't think everybody got everything. You kind of had to choose, maybe, but you probably could have everything if you had the time. But nonetheless, that's a lot of food. Also, I love that even in 2003, they were still serving the Scottish smoked salmon with caviar that they were serving in the 1970s, and that is what I'm about to eat right now. And here we are, a meal served on board the supersonic transport Concorde. So I'm really excited to try these things, not just because I'm excited about the food, but because I'm so excited to use some of the cutlery that I got that is actually from Concorde. Also, this is the napkin holder, napkin ring from Concorde, which I don't know, I just think it's so cool. Like these, it says British Airways, and then it has a little insignia crown on the bottom, and then of course the plates. So this, actually, I'm not eating off of, obviously. There's no food on it, but this one was for kind of hot entrees, and they're all decorated with the Concorde, as you can see, kind of in a line, which is just so clever. And then I love this tiny plate, which was meant to just hold a pat of butter. My favorite. But I'm actually going to start with the next biggest plate, holding the Scottish salmon and creme fraiche and caviar. I've only had caviar, I think, once in my entire life, and I honestly can't remember if I liked it or not. So I'm going to take apart one of these beautiful roses, because I don't want to just have like 3 ounces of salmon all in one bite. I want to savor it. But I am going to take some caviar and some creme fraiche, put that on there, make a mini canapé. Here we go. I love Scottish salmon, smoked salmon. It is so good. The creme fraiche really adds a wonderful creaminess to the texture, which is really, really nice. I don't know if I'm getting caviar. I have to try the caviar just by itself, because at $80 an ounce, you'd think that you would taste it a little bit better. I actually had a caviar spoon around here. I don't know where it went, so I'm using this one. Here we go. So it's all about the texture, because you kind of like pop in your mouth. It's good. It's I don't even want to say salty. It's more like saline. Not that that's any different, but that's the word that I want to use. I have caviar in between my teeth now. Gross. But the flavor is just very mild. I don't quite get why it's so expensive. Maybe there's really strong caviar. It's not fishy, but it's actually really good. It's the texture, though, that I like. I'm a fan. Okay, now we move on to the lobster with beurre blanc sauce. And I'm actually going to just try some of the beurre blanc, and I'm going to try it straight from the pot because I think it's a little bit hotter. So let me get this whole pot over here. Oh my God. I mean, that's ridiculous. It's just shallots and butter. So I'm not sure what else I would expect, but that's wonderful. It's like silky, creamy sauce. It's amazing the science that turns like the butter into that texture. And it is just so flavorful with the shallots, but without any of the bite that like a normal shallot uncooked would have. I love cooked shallots or onions or whatever. Okay, now I'm going to have from the largest plate, the lobster, which is still warm, but since it's just a little bit of sauce, it's kind of cooled down. So let me just cut up. I shouldn't use a spoon, I should use a fork. Cut a little piece here. Or a big piece, and try it just without the beurre blanc. Very expensive. And now with the beurre blanc. You need the sauce. Lobster doesn't actually have a lot of flavor. I need to do a whole video on lobster. Doesn't have a lot of flavor to it. Again, it's more about the texture and then whatever you serve with it. And usually it's something with butter. The paprika doesn't really add any flavor. It's really just there for a look. So it's just plain lobster, which it needs something else, and it is that beurre blanc that it needs. So I lament the fact that I never got to fly aboard Concorde, but I am so grateful that I can taste some of the food on the actual dishes that were aboard that magnificent flying machine. And don't forget that I'm putting a link down in the description to where you can sign up for the 3 Tasting History cruises that are coming up. They sell out rather quickly, so if you are interested, just jump on that, make some Concorde food, and I will see you next time on Tasting History. Last week we looked at what it was like to dine aboard the Lusitania, the ocean liner that was sunk by a German torpedo during World War I. Well, this week I'm going to look at what the men in the U-boat that actually fired that torpedo were eating. Perhaps something like this 1915 German recipe for sauerkraut soup. So thank you to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video as we dive and dine in a World War I U-boat, this time on Tasting History. There are numerous cookbooks from Germany written during World War I that are filled with recipes specifically for wartime. Many were written for those on the home front, others for those in the trenches, and while I couldn't find one specifically written for the Imperial Navy, I thought that this cookbook, Kriegskochbuch or War Cookbook, would fit the brief. Especially because it was published in 1915, which was the year that Lusitania was sunk. And since it was published fairly early on in the war started in 1914, it's before the really terrible food shortages hit Germany. That said, the recipes in it are still rather basic, and so many of them would only include ingredients that you could find on a German U-boat, like this recipe for Sauerkrautsuppe, which actually just says to follow the previous recipe for pickle soup, but use sauerkraut. So subbing sauerkraut for pickles, the recipe says the fat and flour are whisked and the water is slowly added. When the soup has simmered, the sauerkraut is added. Salt and vinegar are added to the soup and seasoned. Very basic. Now, what's a little frustrating is while the recipe gives exact amounts for the water, for the fat, or we're going to use butter and the flour, it doesn't tell you exactly how much sauerkraut to use, so we're going to just kind of have to guess at that, and that's kind of an issue with a lot of old recipes. They tend to leave out some very important. It was quite good. Now, unfortunately, they did not have lemonberry bundt cake aboard a German U-boat during World War I, So if you want to eat like they did, then what you're going to need is 2 tablespoons of butter or other fat, 4 tablespoons or 30 grams of flour, 1.5 liters of water, 1 to 2 tablespoons of vinegar, some salt, and 2 to 3 cups of sauerkraut. Like I said, they didn't tell you how much sauerkraut to use, so I'm using quite a bit because otherwise it's really just thickened water. But it's kind of up to you and probably dependent on what period of the war you're in. Now, they would have had all of these ingredients aboard a U-boat, at least at the beginning of any mission, because over time, many of the perishable ingredients would go bad, and so they wouldn't have those for much of the mission. But let's pretend we're at the beginning of a voyage and we still have butter. So the first thing you want to do is melt that butter. The recipe actually doesn't specify butter, it just says fat. But they did often have butter aboard the ship, so that's what I'm using. So once it's melted, add the flour and whisk it together. You're essentially making a roux here. Though typically a roux is a 1-to-1 ratio, this is a 1-to-2 ratio, basically half the fat as usual. And the only thing I can think is that even at the beginning of the war, they were rationing things like butter, so maybe that's what makes this a wartime cookbook. Either way, keep whisking it together for 3 or 4 minutes or until it turns a golden brown. Then slowly add the water, whisking to get the roux to dissolve. Once it's all dissolved into the water, let it come to a simmer, and once simmering, add in the sauerkraut. Stir it all together, and then let it return to a simmer. And let it simmer for about 15 minutes, which should be plenty of time to go back to 1915 and see what other kind of provisions they would have on a German U-boat. During World War I, German U-boats, which stands for Unterseeboot, or undersea boats, were rather varied and evolved quite a bit in the 4 years of conflict. In 1914, they only had 20 working subs, most of which were powered by kerosene, but by the end of the war, they had made over 350 diesel-powered U-boats. They still had a lot of variation, but an average vessel like U-20, the U-boat that sank the Lusitania, was 210 feet long, 20 feet wide, and 27 feet tall. Now with a crew of 36, you would think that that's plenty of room for everyone on the boat, but it turns out most of the space is not actually livable. A fair amount of the space is given over to large tanks that would flood with seawater when diving, and then the ends of the boat were home to the torpedoes. There were 7 torpedoes in all that would shoot from 2 tubes at the bow and 2 at the stern. Then there was the engine room, which had 2 850 horsepower diesel engines and tanks for 76 tons of diesel fuel, and 2 600 horsepower electric engines with massive batteries, which were used when the U-boat was submerged. This left precious little room for actual living. There was, of course, the captain's quarters, and then the control room, and then there was a small area for the wireless operator and bunks for all of the crew. And almost as an afterthought, there was a rather small kitchen and 2 mess areas, one for the crew and one for the officers. The question is, where does the food that's going to get cooked in that kitchen actually get stored? And the answer is everywhere. Before leaving Germany, a U-boat was laden down with sausages, fresh meat, potatoes, flour, eggs, butter, milk, coffee, sugar, tea, salted fish, peas, bacon, and a lot of canned meat, vegetables, and fruits and bread. It was stuffed under bunks, hung from pipes overhead, stuffed in the latrine, or if it was perishable, like the vegetables and milk, it would actually be kept in the ammunition room because that room they wisely kept much cooler than the rest of the sub. Unfortunately, while that might work in the North Sea, in the Mediterranean and the Adriatic, even that room just was not cool enough, so they didn't get to carry around a lot of the prized ingredients. In the heat of summer, carrying meat with us was out of the question. That made eggs all the more desirable. Once we had no eggs for a whole month, and vegetables and macaroni were our most substantial dishes. Now, a crew of fighting men need better food than that. And even in the cold of the North Sea, you would only have those perishable goods for the first 10 days of any mission. After that, they would usually go bad. So the vast majority of the food on board was pickled or dried or canned. And even some of those more shelf-stable foods would not fare very well on a submarine, because in a submarine, it was like a tropical jungle. The temperature could get up to 100 degrees, and it was very poorly ventilated. This was especially bad when the boat was submerged, which it didn't spend that much time typically underwater, but it didn't take very long to get all sweaty and gross in there, especially because the heat on the inside of the sub and the cold water on the outside of the sub would kind of hit each other and form condensation all on the walls of the inside of the sub, which they called U-boat sweat. This created the perfect conditions for mold. Mold was on their clothes, it was on their blankets, in their shoes, and of course, it would grow on their food. Add to this the fact that even with the ventilation, there was always a little bit of diesel fumes inside of the sub, and that would mix with the condensation and create little oil slicks on the top of their soup and their coffee, and that's gross, and I'm not going to be doing that for today's soup. No oil. So 10 days into what was typically a month-long patrol, and they were starting to run out of all the good food, and their other food would have like oil and mold on it. You'd think these people would go mad. Well, in 1928, the author Lowell Thomas interviewed a number of officers from different U-boats and put their thoughts down in a book called Raiders of the Deep. And in there, the commander of U-64 says, "Food, that is always the great problem in a submarine. On a long voyage, that interminable diet of canned stuff with peas and bacon as the pièce de résistance becomes unbearable. Since then, I've never been able to look at a pea in the face. As for the bacon, on that point, I'll be a Mohammedan to the end of my days." Though sometimes, even if the food was nothing to write home about, the meal itself was worth being remembered, as Lieutenant Rudolf Zentner recalled of his first Christmas at war aboard U-20, which was the U-boat that sunk the Lusitania. The tiny mess room was decorated in style. A green wreath hung at one end as a Christmas tree. We didn't have any lighted candles on it. They would have been too risky in the oil-reeking interior of a submarine. The tables were loaded with food. It all came out of cans, but we didn't mind that. That one night, officers and men had their mess together. It was rather close quarters. We had a crew of 4 officers and 32 men. We were all in our leather submarine suits. It was no dress affair, no stiff bosoms, no coattails, no fish and soup, as you call them. In short, there were many drawbacks, but good spirits were not one of them. In the tight, overcrowded little mess room, we ate and talked. The dinner was washed down with tea mixed with rum, and I lost count of the number of toasts that were drunk. But sadly, every day can't be Christmas. So most of the time, when the food was crummy, so was the crew. And so it was up to the crew to figure out other ways to get quality food on board their boat. U-19, after a long cruise in the North Sea, came upon one of the Orkney Islands in the north of Scotland. This island was known to be uninhabited by people, but chock full of goats. So a party went ashore with rifles. The hunt for wild goats was a thing to delight a sportsman's heart. They accumulated a good buck and returned to the boat. That day there was a magnificent feast of roast goat aboard a U-boat in the subarctic. But there are only so many goat-filled islands to go hunting on, so more often the U-boats had to rely on the spoils of war. Especially following the sinking of the Lusitania and a promise to allow crews off their ships before they sunk, U-boats would plunder merchant ships for whatever food they had before sinking the ship. This would often lead to their pantries full to bursting, but that would make it difficult to control the men. It used to be no uncommon sight to see sailors of the submarine service going home on leave loaded down with parcels of sugar, bacon, ham, and so on, which represented stuff taken from prizes. Very welcome presents for their families, which were bearing the rigors of Germany's wartime shortage. The men would often get to enjoy the spoils of war, but this was only after the officers had taken their fair share. Robert Morat, who was the commander of U-64, used to usually dine in the officers' mess, but when there were special ingredients coming aboard, he would test them out in his room. There would be a cloth spread on my desk while Haupt brought me coffee, hard bread, marmalade, and a pancake baked on the electric stove. The marmalade was a luxury. I remember to this day a heaven-sent ship that I sunk on which we found enough marmalade to last for 6 months. No, I shall never forget that ship. This same commander had a lot to say about the food on the U-boat, as well as the cook on the U-boat, a man named Midtank. And he says that had Midtank had quality ingredients, he probably would have been a fine cook, but as it was, his food was not very good because of the ingredients. And the men would make fun of Midtank for this, but Midtank was very sensitive and would take it to heart, and so he was always threatening to get a transfer to another U-boat where he would be appreciated. And so the commander would have to give him all of these false compliments just to calm him down. He'd say, "Midtank, you ought to see what I wrote to my wife this morning. I told her that those pancakes you cooked for me were absolutely delicious. And I told her also that there never was such bacon and peas as you make." He says on one occasion the cook was so upset that the only way to placate him was to promise him the opportunity to earn an Iron Cross, the medal that the military gave out. But that was typically for combat stuff, not for cooking. So one day, when they were having a firefight on deck, he had Midtank taking ammunition up and down the stairs, and he did so for quite some time and with some aplomb, and so he used that as a pretext to put him in for an Iron Cross, which he got. So the cook aboard the U-boat got an Iron Cross. Now, while it was always the goal to plunder these ships for the choicest ingredients before actually sinking them, it wasn't always practical. As Lieutenant Zentner explained, a U-boat cannot always venture to send a boarding crew on a prize and snatch a bit of fresh meat and vegetables. We had to content ourselves with canned stuff, dried stuff, and hardtack, and on long cruises the fare sometimes became intolerable. I remember one occasion when we became positively desperate for a decent bite to eat. We managed to capture a fine hogshead of butter. For a couple days we piled butter on our hardtack and thought it delicious. Everybody said that the butter would do well for cooking, only we didn't have anything decent to cook with it. The sailors positively sang a chorus of, "If only we had something to fry in the butter." Well, as nice as it is to spread a bunch of butter on hardkeks, the German word for hardtack, they were definitely on the scout for something to cook in this butter, and so they happened upon some French fishing boats, and they submerged and went in between the boats, and then they surfaced. And Lieutenant Zentner says that the fishermen probably thought that they were about to be killed, but then started laughing and cheering when they found out that the only thing the Germans wanted was some of their fish. "We crammed our boat with fish, fine big fellows, bonitos with a pinkish meat. And now there was fresh fish, fried in butter, grilled in butter, sautéed in butter, all that we could eat." Now, it wasn't just fish and butter that they were bringing aboard their U-boats, because after they made this promise to allow the passengers and crew of merchant ships to get off into their lifeboats before blowing up the ship, they would often have to take some of these passengers and crew onto the U-boat, because if they were out in the middle of the Atlantic, they couldn't just leave them out there. Now, I'm sure there was a lot of variation in how these people were treated, usually as prisoners, but there are some stories of, like, one German cook on a U-boat made a little girl a cake with some canned fruit and whipped cream, and then there was an American boat that was sunk, and the man who came aboard the U-boat ended up writing about his experience. Their food was good. In the morning we had rolls and fresh butter. The butter was fine. The bread was black and came in loaves about 3 feet long. We had cognac nearly all the time. The members of the crew were cheerful and joked with us, especially after indulging in cognac. They were apparently young fellows and frequently talked of their mothers. And it wasn't just people on these U-boats, but animals too. U-20 actually saved a black dachshund named Maria from one of the boats that they sank and brought her on board. The issue was that they already had another dog on board who was a male, and very soon dear Maria was pregnant and gave birth to 4 puppies, and that was just too many dogs on one boat, so they gave 3 of them to other U-boats. But still, 3 dogs on one U-boat, that's a lot of mouths to feed. And while I'm not sure what the dogs ate, the monkeys ate eggs and bananas. Yes, there was a monkey on a U-boat. Her name was Phipps, and she was notorious for sneaking into the kitchen and stealing eggs while the cook's back was turned. She was Lothar von Arnold's monkey aboard U-35, the most successful U-boat in the war. This U-boat sank 220 merchant vessels during the war, and one of those was an Italian steamer that was chock full of bananas. As the vessel went down, hundreds of bananas floated on the surface. The dinghy went out and collected a boatload. We spread the bananas out to ripen a bit in the hot Mediterranean sun. We managed to gorge ourselves with bananas. Nothing like Phipps, though. The yellow fruit seemed to remind her of her tropical home. She leaped, chattered, and shrieked with delight, and ate more bananas than I thought her small body would contain. A monkey eating bananas. How predictable. Luckily, I don't think monkeys eat sauerkraut, so the sauerkraut soup would at least be safe aboard a U-boat, and it should be ready to finish off here in my kitchen. So after the sauerkraut has simmered for 15 minutes, add a tablespoon of white wine vinegar and a teaspoon of salt. Then stir it in and give it a taste to see if it needs any more of either, and then serve. And here we are, German sauerkraut soup from World War I. Now I'm going to eat this with some Schwarzbrot, or black bread. It's a bread that was very popular on the U-boats. It's made of dark rye. They would often actually have it canned, but sometimes they would have fresh loaves, especially at the beginning of a voyage. So I'm going to have a little bit of that. But first, I'm going to just try the soup as it is. It smells like sauerkraut. I don't know what I was expecting. Tastes like sauerkraut soup, which is what it is. I mean, the sauerkraut is definitely the flavor that you're getting. There's not a lot else to get. It's just water and roux, a little salt and vinegar. But if you like sauerkraut, it's a nice way of eating it. And I'm guessing if you really hadn't had much else, it would be quite delicious. There's not a lot else there, so it's not a very complicated flavor, except that sauerkraut is kind of a complicated flavor in and of itself. But try it with some of this black bread, Schwarzbrot. Actually, that's quite good. That's quite good. That bread is delicious. It's not as dark as pumpernickel, which is another rye, and so it's not quite as rye-y, rye forward. I really like that bread. And with the kind of sourness, the acidity from the soup, they kind of balance each other out. So I think that would actually be a pretty good meal. And maybe, like they were saying, you could have it with some tea and rum, I believe was what they drank that one Christmas. Yeah, it's really easy, so there's not any reason that you shouldn't try it if you like sauerkraut. If you don't like sauerkraut, just swap out the sauerkraut for a big old pickle, and then you're making the pickle soup, which they mentioned. Everything else stays exactly the same. You could also do it with a head of cabbage. That's another recipe in there. Also with beets, that's another recipe in there. They're all pretty much the same, just swapping out the vegetables. So yeah, that is food from World War I that might have been served on a German U-boat. And if you want to see more wartime recipes from World War I or World War II, let me know what you want to see in the comments. I've got a few things planned, but I'm always looking for ideas, and I will see you. Alcatraz, one of history's most notorious prisons, housing criminals like Al Capone and Machine Gun Kelly, was also infamous for its food. Yes, as heinous as the reputation for the prison was, at least dinner on the Rock was something the inmates could look forward to. So thank you to Bright Cellars for sponsoring this video as we recreate a dinner on Alcatraz, this time on Tasting History. So there are several menus from Alcatraz from the 1940s and 50s, and when I looked at them, I saw something I didn't really expect, and that's that the inmates ate pretty well. For example, in 1946, in September, on one random Monday dinner, which was actually the midday meal, they had split pea soup, roast shoulder of pork, sage dressing, brown gravy, mashed potatoes, stewed corn, apple pie, and bread and coffee with milk. Not bad. And the food was supposed to be pretty good because not only was it for the inmates, but the guards ate it as well. Now, there are no recipes from the kitchens at the time, but as it happens, in 1952, the Alcatraz Women's Club, which were the wives and families of the guards and other people living on the island, they put together a cookbook of dishes that were served there. So using those recipes, I'm going to make a full meal fit for an inmate, albeit a smaller meal than that random Monday dinner. I'll make Mrs. Viola Delmore's stuffed pork chops, Mrs. Mildred Keppel's cucumber salad, and Mrs. Ruth Langley's quickie apple pie. So for the pork chops, she says cut pockets in chops and fill with mixture of half cup breadcrumbs, half cup chopped apple, and 1 teaspoon minced onion. Season with salt, pepper, and sage. Fasten with picks. Bake in moderate oven 350 degrees about 1 hour. Now you want fairly thick pork chops, at least an inch, so you can slice a deep pocket in the chop almost enough to slice it in two. Then in a bowl, add your half cup of dried breadcrumbs and a half cup of finely chopped apple and 1 teaspoon of minced onion and some chopped sage. Plus about a 1/4 teaspoon of salt and a teaspoon of pepper. Mix all of that together and then stuff it into the pork chops. And the finer your ingredients are, the easier it will be to stuff your chops. Then fasten them shut with toothpicks, set them on a lined baking sheet, and put them in the oven at 350 degrees Fahrenheit, 175 Celsius. Now, Mrs. Viola Delmore says to bake these for 1 hour, and I can tell you, that is way too long. You're gonna have some dry chops. I would say almost about half that time, like 30, maybe 35 minutes should do you pretty good. Now, while you sip your wine and your pork chops bake, you can get started on your cucumber salad. Good to have a little bit of vegetables with your dinner, especially if you don't get a lot of exercise time in the yard. So for Mrs. Mildred Keppel's cucumber salad, she says to whip evaporated milk until stiff, add vinegar and sugar to make a sweet sour dressing, add a dash of paprika and salt, pour over sliced cucumbers and onions. So I took a can of evaporated milk and I whipped it for a long time, like 20 or 25 minutes, and I had expected it to get to the consistency of like whipped cream, and it did not. It frothed up and it did get thicker, but not really like whipped cream like I expected. But then she does say that you're supposed to pour it, so I guess I shouldn't be that surprised. I also wish that she was a little more specific with exactly how much vinegar and sugar you're supposed to use to make this sweet sour dressing. I started with a teaspoon of vinegar and then I added a tablespoon of sugar, but you might want to taste as you kind of go along because I ended up adding a little bit more of each of those to get a sweet sour dressing. Then add in about a 1/4 teaspoon of paprika and a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. Mix all of this together and set it aside. Then slice up a couple of cucumbers and an onion, then mix those together and pour the dressing over them and toss it until it is coated. So that is 2 of the 3 dishes we're going to make, and the last one is a quickie apple pie, and it really is a quickie. But before we get to dessert, I wanted to share with you the most funny, if that's the word for it, recipe in the book. The thing is, it's not really funny like ha ha, it's more funny like heh heh. It's Mrs. Robert Murphy's recipe for well-bred children. Take 1 large grassy field, a half dozen children, 2 or 3 small dogs, and a pinch of brook and some pebbles. Mix the children and dogs together and put them in a field. Stirring constantly, pour the brook over the pebbles, sprinkle the field with flowers. Spread over all a deep blue sky and bake in the sun. When brown, set to cool in a bathtub. What even is that? Are you okay, Mrs. Robert Murphy? Maybe living on a prison island just isn't really good for one's psyche. And she was the wife of a guard. Just imagine the effect that it had if you were an inmate. The island of Alcatraz, once the site of a military prison, became a federal penitentiary in 1934, and by 1937 had earned the nickname Uncle Sam's Devil's Island. And being an island, it was rather small for a federal penitentiary, only being able to hold 336 prisoners, and typically only housed about 275. But they were 275 of the most notorious and dangerous criminals in the country, like Al Capone, Machine Gun Kelly, and the Birdman of Alcatraz, who ironically was not allowed to have birds while at Alcatraz. But most of the prisoners were really not famous. They were there because they were extremely violent and very often rule breakers that weren't able to live in the other prisons without trying to escape. It was notoriously difficult to escape from Alcatraz. The facility was maximum security, minimum privilege, but food was not considered a privilege. As an inmate on Alcatraz, you had 4 rights: medical care, clothing, shelter, and food. And of those 4, the food had the best reputation. This was in a large part due to the prison's first warden, James Saltwater Johnston. Saltwater because he was as salty as the water that surrounded the island. He set some of the rigid rules that gave the prison its reputation for the next 3 decades. For the first 4 years, he employed a rigid rule of silence, which prohibited inmates from speaking in the cell blocks, at work, and even in the mess hall. But the warden wasn't all for punishment just for punishment's sake. Rather, he was all for punishment as a way to keep order. And that's why he wanted good food, because he felt that bad food led to disorder, led to prison riots. So if there was good food, there'd be order. And not only was the food good, but he allowed the inmates to have as much as they wanted. But you had to eat what you took. We fed the inmates cafeteria style. They'd go in and put their food on a tray. You have to eat what you take. If you leave any, you don't eat the next meal. Then you go and sit 10 to a table, 5 facing 5. They had about 20 minutes to eat. A guard stood at the end of every table. The reason for the watchful eye was because the mess hall could be one of the most dangerous places in the prison. First of all, it was one of the few times when all of the inmates were gathered together and they had access to spoons, forks, and knives for eating. And at the end of the meal, they had to take all their silverware and put them in precise places on their tray so that the guard could count them, make sure nothing was missing. Even so, the mess hall every year was the scene of several small riots. Tables would be flipped and silverware along with hot coffee would be used as weapons against the other inmates and against the guards present. But there were ways of quickly putting down a mess hall riot. First of all, the mess hall was sometimes referred to as the gas chamber because there were 14 canisters of tear gas in the ceiling that could go off with a remote control. But that usually didn't happen. They didn't need to take that kind of action because most of the guards outside of the hall were carrying Tommy submachine guns, and so a few little rat-a-tat-tats and, order was restored. But most days, no rioting took place at all. And when the inmates got up, the guard counted the silverware, a knife, fork, and spoon for every man, and then they all went out. The officers ate the same food. So as strict as the setup was, the food was pretty good. In fact, it was often considered the best in the entire U.S. prison system at the time. One former inmate recalled the food at Alcatraz was as good as you would get in a good restaurant that specialized in home-cooked meals. Better than most. And so what were some of these restaurant-worthy meals? Well, breakfast included things like applesauce, fresh oranges, shredded wheat, and hot griddle cakes with honey. Dinner always came with a soup like split pea, potato chowder, or minestrone, then had an entree of meatloaf, corned beef, or breaded rock cod, along with sides like coleslaw, fresh green beans, or corn on the cob. Then supper in the evening would see the same soup from dinner along with another entree like meat croquettes with bechamel, spaghetti with meat sauce, or jambalaya. Then a dessert like cupcakes or even apricot pie. I gotta say, I was pretty shocked at the variety, and it seems that the food needed to be presented in a pleasing looking manner. And then later on, starting around the 1950s, the menu actually had to be worded in a way that made the food enticing. The June peas was an excellent choice, and this trick of menu making should be exploited as much as possible when certain foods are in season. Other words that come to mind are baby, young, milk-fed, spring, new, fresh, native, various colors such as mashed yellow turnips, cold such as chilled tomato juice, old-fashioned, homemade, etc. The title of a dish can do much in creating anticipation. That was the supervisor of culinary operations at the prison. Though all of this, the good food and the pleasing descriptions, was only if you behaved, if you followed the rules, because should you break the rules and find yourself in solitary confinement, then you could expect to get for breakfast a half bowl of milk and cereal, a half bowl of soup with 4 slices of bread for dinner, and the same for supper. Though on Thanksgiving, even those in solitary got a full Thanksgiving dinner, pumpkin pie included. Now, while that may seem a small amount of food, it was actually a lot better than most of the prisons at the time. Because, yes, it was a meager ration, but you still got 3 meals a day in solitary, where a lot of other prisons were giving 2 or even 1 a day to some prisoners. At Alcatraz, there was actually a concerted effort to stop corporal punishment, including restricting someone's food. So rather than harming the body through lashings or cold hoses and stuff like that, they sought to damage the will and the spirit of the inmates, which I guess was an improvement. But it led to many of the inmates describing Alcatraz as the toughest, hardest place in the world. The mausoleum of the living dead, lifeless automatons on the rock of despair. Some sources actually say that a way to break the spirit was by feeding them well. There were times when inmates would be receiving upwards of 5,000 calories a day, and they received very, very little exercise, so they became lethargic. Nobody wants to start a prison riot after a big old mountain of mashed potatoes. That's why, rather than the prison, Alcatraz, using food as a punishment, it was the inmates who used not eating food as a way to protest against bad conditions in the prison. There were several hunger strikes on Alcatraz. Warden Johnson said of one that, "So far as I can judge, at this moment, the men seem to be making their annual bid for attention, and perhaps came to the conclusion that striking was not the way to do it, but going without food, a la Mahatma Gandhi, would be a better sort of protest." You know he didn't pronounce it Gandhi. Now, yes, the prisoners would use food as a way to protest, but if that food quality suffered, then they would protest, or rather riot, about that as well. One of the most famous incidents was in 1950, and it was called the Spaghetti Riot. Now, spaghetti was nothing new to the menu at Alcatraz, but in 1950, the quality of that spaghetti started to diminish over and over, every single week a little worse, until finally one inmate called it noodles with plum sauce. And another inmate basically said, if we see this on the menu again, we're flipping tables, we're going to start a riot. Next week, there was the spaghetti. So a riot broke out, putting the lives of the guards in the mess hall in danger. But the guards on the outside still had those Thompson submachine guns. I jammed that actuating lever back and she went click. Everybody heard it and knew what it meant. You look at that big muzzle staring down in there and it's just like staring down the mouth of a cannon. I said, "Lieutenant, blow your whistle." The inmates started to get up and walked out of the cafeteria just like lambs. Now, spaghetti riots aside, working in the kitchens was actually one of the most coveted jobs at Alcatraz. Up to 10% of the prison population worked in there at any given time. Partly, it was because when you were a cook, you got to take a daily shower, which not everyone did. Also, they tended to be treated better by the guards. First of all, they were making the food that the guards were going to eat, and second of all, they were the most trusted of inmates. They were just given a job that had knives. And early on, before the 1950s and regulations kind of tightened, they had a lot of freedom in what they were making and would even make special little dishes just for themselves, just for the kitchen crew. Former public enemy number one, Alvin Karpis, nicknamed Creepy Karpis, went to work in the kitchens in 1943, where he'd bake himself and his friends all sorts of special little pastries, and with access to yeast and fruit, would whip up batches of prison wine. He was actually written up in 1945 when he was found staggering around the yard, drunk on his own brew. But he was not the only one. Many of the inmates would take out scraps of potato peelings or little pieces of fruit and yeast and would make their own wines and other batches of who knows what in other parts of the prison. In fact, they would take little matchboxes and fill them with baker's yeast and sell them to prisoners who didn't work in the kitchen for $5 a pop. Now, there are a multitude of reasons why in 1963, after 29 years in operation, Alcatraz closed as a prison. But the number one reason was cost. It was 3 times as expensive to house an inmate at Alcatraz than pretty much any other prison, because everything on that island had to be brought over from San Francisco by boat. Every gallon of water, every bag of flour, and every apple. Like the 6 apples that you'll need to make this quickie apple pie. Now, there are a few things that Mrs. Ruth Langley cuts out to make this apple pie quickie, but the most quickie making thing of the apple pie is that there is no crust. She says to take 6 tart apples, then peel and cut them into slices, then place them in a deep pie pan and cover with cold water. Then you set that pan on the stove and bring it to a boil for about 5 minutes. While it boils, take 3/4 cup or 90 grams of flour and 1 cup or 200 grams of sugar and whisk them together. Once the apples are boiled, spread the flour and sugar over the top, pressing it down until juice comes up to cover the top, but don't mix it into the apples. I guess this is her version of a crust. Then take about 2 tablespoons of butter in little pieces and dot the top, then sprinkle that with cinnamon and pop it in the oven at 350 degrees Fahrenheit, 175 Celsius for 15 to 20 minutes or just until the top starts to brown. And that's it. That is your 3 dishes. So add a cup of coffee or tea and a slice of bread, and you got yourself a dinner fit for an inmate at Alcatraz prison. It looks pretty good, except for the apple pie. Apple pie does not look good, but it actually smells really good. Smells like an apple pie. So maybe it's just not the prettiest of things. But I'm going to start with the pork chop. Here we go. Yeah, I overcooked that pork. Still good though, tastes good. Even 35 minutes was too long on the pork. I don't know what she's doing for an hour. Even if it was a huge pork chop, it's just way too long. But the flavor is really good. Because there's nothing particularly special about the pork chop, it's pork chop. But the stuffing is really nice. There's just a little bit of spice there from the pepper, but the sweetness of the apples is really what comes through. It tastes a lot like a stuffing, I guess, with the breadcrumbs, because with the apples giving moisture to the breadcrumbs, what went in as sort of a dry filling is now nice and stuffing-ish. It's good. Now I have to admit, I'm a little more worried about the cucumbers here with onions. Let me get an onion. But here we go. It's not bad. You get that sweet and tangy kind of sourness of the dressing. I wish I had added more paprika. I think that would just kind of liven it up. The main flavor is still the onion and the cucumber. I think the onion just kind of overpowers the cucumber. But it's nice and refreshing and would probably be a welcome thing to be eating if you spent your entire day inside of a cell. Finally, on to the part that I'm most excited about, this quickie apple pie, because it smells really, really good. It almost looks like some of the apples kind of totally disintegrate into like an applesauce, but then some of the apples are still kind of whole. And it does look kind of like a crust on top, kind of. We'll give it to Miss Langley. That's delicious. It tastes like apple pie. It tastes like just the filling though, because I guess that's kind of all it is. But I didn't think it would be quite as good as it is, because you're not mixing the apples with the spices and the sugar and everything. That's all just going on top. But I guess when it's in the oven, it all kind of melts down through it and flavors everything really nicely. Nice and soft. That's good. It's like apple pie pudding. So if ever I was in Alcatraz, that apple pie pudding, quickie apple pie, that would be something I would definitely go back for, and I would clean my plate for that. Everything else about Alcatraz kind of sounds horrible, but that's good. So I mean, nothing here is like, oh, you gotta go make this, but it is cool to eat foods that they would have eaten, you know, in the world's most notorious prison, or one of them. But if you are in need of an apple pie and don't want to make an apple pie, make this quickie apple pie. It's actually quite worth it. And I will see you next time